Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Radical Candor podcast. I'm Jason Rosoff.
I'm Amy Sandler. Today we're talking about a topic that we get lots of questions about, which is how can I introduce Radical Candor to my team? And Jason, you recently wrote a LinkedIn post about this recently. It offered a fresh perspective that folks may not have considered. And I'm just going to quote you, if I may.
Sure.
Thank you. You wrote, quote, "When building a more radically candid culture, I've found that starting small is the way to go. As someone who loves to tinker and experiment, I've seen firsthand how big changes often start with small tweaks. Trying to change the culture of an entire company or organization all at once is like trying to boil the ocean. It will take all of your energy and it's impossible." And I'm wondering, when you were reflecting on that, were you thinking of certain examples where companies have tried to sort of just go so big that it wasn't able to be impactful? Or what was on your mind when you were thinking about the start small guidance?
One of the reasons I recommend starting small is because you can't make people change. People have to decide to change. And from my perspective, that means you need to create the conditions that make change seem more interesting than staying the same. And I've never found a way to do that really big, because when you try to do that at a really large scale, I think there's a little bit of like bystander syndrome. Like everybody's waiting for somebody else to go first. Whereas if you do it in a small group, it's really easy to encourage a small group of people to all take a step forward together. And I can think of an example that's unrelated to feedback. But if you think about wanting to, let's say, go to yoga more or something like that, it's a lot easier to commit to that change if you have a friend or two who are willing to go with you to class. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Because like there's a small commitment that you're making to that person. They help to hold you accountable. You feel like you were sort of missing out on something by not participating in it. And I think the same thing is true for any other kind of social activity, which feedback is a fundamentally social activity. And so if you say we're all going to take a small step together, that's a better place to start than the whole company. Everybody is responsible for doing this, and that doesn't mean you shouldn't communicate about the intention, like where you want to go as an organization. That's fine, but the actual implementation really requires you to start small, and there's some other reasons for that, but that's my primary thinking.
Yeah, I love that. And just if we kind of drill down on what you're saying, there's one part which is start small, and then there's another part about communicating. So we'll start with the starting small piece. And what you said is really interesting, I think, both in terms of individual change and also organizational change. So even just from an individual change perspective, I know for myself, I teach these things to help myself hold myself accountable. It's not just starting small. What I hear you saying, though, you're also talking about supporting with other people. Like we don't have to do it on our own. So it's almost like start small, but not so small, one person small actually with success partners, a small group. And one of the things that I really liked that you introduced in that LinkedIn post was this idea of pockets of excellence. So talk a little bit more about, first of all, just the phrase pockets of excellence, I think is something that's quite memorable. But what is it about a small group that can get some momentum going?
Going back to the yoga example for a second, I think the idea of a small group is like, it's sort of easy for one person to fail and nobody to notice. It's a little bit harder for two people to not keep their commitments. I don't want to say fail, to not keep their commitment, and for no one to notice. It's really hard for three people to not keep a commitment and nobody notices. So there's like a minimum group size. I think it's a minimum of about three people that know what's going on and are helping to hold one another accountable. But the idea of a pocket of excellence, like it really was born out of this sense that you want to show people, to be able to demonstrate to people why this change is worthwhile. And that I think requires some social proof, a demonstration of like what the benefits of this can be. And it's easier to extract those stories and those benefits more quickly if you're starting with a smaller group of people, right? imagine 100 people just taking the time to get the stories from people about, what worked and what did. Like, it would take weeks to collect all the data and all this other stuff. But with a small group, 3 to 5 people, I feel like you could get a couple of those stories and share them pretty quickly, right? Within a week or two,
Yeah.
you would already have some data that you could share back with others.
Yeah, that's great. And even the language, I think, is important. I know we shifted language a bit, even from accountability partners to success partners. Like,
Yeah.
invested in your success, accountability can sound a little bit like somebody's just waiting for you to, quote, fail, like you were saying, rather than we are our own pocket of excellence. How can we support each other in growing?
Yeah. I think I'm not so afraid of the word accountability, but I understand why other people are. I do think that the problem with the word accountability is people assume that not meeting the thing that you're accountable to will lead to punishment.
Hmm.
I think like that's like that's a cultural thing to pay attention to. Like, if people are afraid of accountability, they're probably not actually afraid of accountability. They're afraid of being punished, and probably afraid of being punished unfairly for not accomplishing something. But I think the point is a good one, which is that the focus should not be on failure. The focus should be on success. And what you're looking for in the pocket of excellence are success stories, right? The times where it worked well. This is sort of aligns with our guidance around praise.
Hmm.
When we say focus on the good stuff, if you talk about what's working well, that's not only helpful to the person who did the thing because they learned something valuable about how they could succeed again in the future, but to other people who learn something about what success looks like. It's the same principle applied to sort of group dynamics or sort of social behavioral change, where you say, we want to talk about the moments that we were successful. Our failures are important to recognize, because if there's something systemic that we can do to help prevent those failures, that's really useful information. But most of the time, what people are struggling with is they don't know what a positive example of a feedback culture looks like. They've never experienced one. And so sharing those success stories makes a big difference, because it actually creates a space in people's minds where they can imagine what it would look like to have that culture and have it be a positive experience.
Yeah, I love that you brought in the praise. I may have mentioned this on previous podcasts, but one of the things that we did, um, through having more virtual sessions, was being able to have a first session and then a second follow-up session. And so in that second follow-up session, we've been able to check in on, hey, how's it going with your practice of specific and sincere praise? How's it going with your go-to question, your soliciting feedback practice? And one of the things that has worked really well with that was that people realized, oh, when we focus on the good stuff, the praise doesn't have to be, hey, Jason, you just launched this whole huge thing, this big effort. It was actually, hey, Jason, thanks for mentioning this new product update in the most recent, team meeting. It helped me realize where we are with that project. I wasn't sure. And it gave me a direction for what I could do to support it, right? It can be small, incremental changes, and people start to realize, oh, like you're saying, it's a model of success. People don't have to wait for something really big.
Exactly. I think I'm sure everybody who's listening to this has been part of an organization who has announced some cultural initiative where they're like, we're going to fundamentally change, we're going to become customer focused, or we're going to fundamentally change the way that we do something. And part of the problem with that communication is it's hard to simultaneously make it seem like an important change and not make it seem too difficult to get there. Right? Because like when it's important enough, it seems far away, right? Like, if it's really important that we make this change, the tendency is to imagine, well, we must have a long ways to go. And I think the problem with that is it's very demoralizing. You know what I'm saying? First
Yeah.
of all, it starts you out feeling like you're already failing. Right? There's like a sort of internal assumption that somehow you're already failing. And secondly, I think it's sort of paralyzing, because you're like, it seems so insurmountable. Like, how are we going to ever get to where we're going? And if instead those things, the approach to that communication was, we've realized that this is really important and this is a direction that we need to move. And here are some examples where it's already happening. And what we're going to do every week for the next 6 months is we're going to highlight a positive example of a team actually living up to this ideal, or expressing this value, or behaving in accordance with this idea. One, it gives you hope, right? It makes the problem seem less insurmountable. And two, like it helps to build momentum because there's someone else in the organization who's going to look and say, I can do that. Like what that team did, like I can do that. Like Amy and I could accomplish that together. And I think we forget how hard behavioral change actually is. You know what I'm saying? Like I think as we think about what it's going to take, we forget how hard individual behavior change is, and we focus on the sort of like the group too much. And so focusing on like those pockets of excellence, those really good positive examples of where the behavior is already happening or where the shift has already occurred, um, it it creates a sense of optimism that is often missing from conversations about change.
That is such a good point. And I think so. To be clear, when we talk about one of our tips, which is to start small, what we're saying is to start small, both in terms of the number of people, not so small that you feel like you're alone in an island trying to make change, but maybe it's you with two, three, four other folks, pocket of excellence, and start small with not boiling the ocean in terms of the project. Like we're changing the whole organization, but it's, hey, for the next month, let's focus on specific and sincere praise. Like that's going to be our
Yep.
focus for the next month. So small, both in terms of groups, but also in terms of digestible, practical steps and showing people examples of those. And I'm curious, Jason, we'll get into communication, which I heard you mention, but have you found with some of the companies that you've worked with examples of how they've kind of bucketed out that start small or how they showcased internally in the organization, like the good stuff that folks were doing?
Yeah, a really good example of this comes from my Khan Academy days, where we we wanted to bring the voice of our users, our students that were using Khan Academy, into the organization. And we're in Silicon Valley, like right down the road from all of these amazing sort of like software design studios and all this other stuff. And there's a lot in the zeitgeist of like you have to do user research and it has to be incredibly rigorous and all this other stuff. And there was a lot of resistance to the idea that we could afford it, like it seemed very expensive, right, and very difficult, and that b, like there was this risk that it wasn't going to be useful, that if we actually tried to implement this, like the risk was that we wouldn't learn anything. And so what the design team that I was managing at the time decided to do, and I don't get credit for this, they decided to do it, is they took someone, and they said, you know what, we're just going to conduct a couple of user interviews. We're going to take a couple of cycles from one designer. We're going to have them go out and conduct just a handful of interviews. We're going to record them, and then we're going to share some of the insights that we get with the rest of the team at we had like a weekly all hands where a team could sort of raise their hand and say, I want to present something. And so what they did was they took a video of simultaneously of the person's face and the screen as they were trying to use the software, and they were able to show these like very simple things that the person was trying to do that were clearly very frustrating to them. And there was something so tangible about the emotional impact of seeing a young person who, trying to use the website, and failing in a meaningful way to find what they were looking for, to succeed in the goal that they had. That it was like very moving, actually. I think people were sort of like became emotionally invested in this. And the point of this was not to like get budget for user research, but just to show the power of like really representing the voice and the experience of the people that we were trying to serve and making it very tangible. Because we were getting all these accolades and students writing to us saying it's changed my life and teachers saying it's so meaningful. But we felt like there's this story out there that we're missing, which is like some things are just more frustrating than they need to be. And maybe the people we want to help the most, who maybe don't have the fastest internet connection or whatever it is, like they might be struggling more than average. We're able to tell that story by starting really, really small. Mm-hmm. And so this wasn't a user research study. We didn't draw any broad conclusions. All we did was say, hey, there's more to be learned here about what we could do differently. And it would be valuable to spend the time and try to do like a more official research effort based on this. And we did wind up, the team wound up succeeding. I supported them, and we wound up hiring at first an external firm to help us because we didn't have the capacity internally to do it. But over time, we actually created user research as a discipline inside the team as a result of that. So it was really just like, in some ways, it was that one video. You know what I'm saying? Like that that made the difference. This person actually conducted 3 user interviews. It took them about a day of actual like total wall time between conducting the interview, editing the video, and doing the presentation. So 8 total hours, and it had this huge impact on the perception that the team had about the value of user research.
As you were sharing that story, I was kind of going through my extrapolation machine in my head of like, okay, what's sort of a potential version of that for our listeners or people who are trying to bring radical candor to their teams, to their pockets of excellence and beyond. And so one idea, I'm curious, let me know what you think, is like, let's say, Jason, you and I worked at a big company, and you were my manager there, and we started practicing radical candor. I could imagine like we could, rather than some formal interview where we had, fancy video equipment, like the two of us could have a conversation, like film it on an iPhone or in a Zoom and just be like, hey, Jason, you started asking me for feedback. This worked. This didn't work so well. You know what I'm saying? Like, is that kind of what you're thinking? Like almost just like it doesn't have to be big and fancy, just kind of real and heartfelt and just kind of get it out there.
Yeah, the software that we use to conduct the user research cost us $19 a month. Like that was the so like the fancy video is the result of like us paying $20 to use this online software that captured the screen and turned the camera on at the same time, so you could actually like gather this data. Have you found the cheapest possible way to accomplish this goal? Which is important, I think, not just because we are a nonprofit, but because we wanted to show that like the value of the insights far outweighed the cost that we might incur to actually try to gather them. And I think that the spirit of what you're saying is exactly correct. So, for example, I could imagine an even like lower tech version of that, which is something I mentioned in the article, which is just having having someone talk about the feedback that they've received that was really helpful to them. Like it seems like such a small act, but just to say like, hey, Amy, Brandy, and I had decided that we were going to solicit feedback from each other, and I solicited feedback from Amy last week, and she gave me this really great feedback. And I'm sharing with you, one, because I thought it was really valuable, but two, I'm kind of curious. Does anybody else experience that me in the same way? Maybe I'm talking over people in a meeting or something like that. Does anybody else experience me in the same way? And all of a sudden, the team because like usually it is the case, right? Usually it's not just one person's observation. Usually there's more to it than that. And all of a sudden, the team sees not only is feedback helpful to this person, but it's helpful to me. Like I'm a secondary beneficiary of this feedback because now Jason is more aware of this behavior and hopefully we'll be working to correct it.
Yeah. I love that. And also just what you're saying that, and we talked about this, having opportunities in meetings to, especially if we're the leader, to share feedback. One thing, and Jason, you and I have talked about this, is let's say I don't feel comfortable being named in that meeting. Before saying that, you would check with me. Hey, Amy, is it okay if I share that you gave me this feedback, or would you like it just to be, hey, I got some feedback from the team?
Yeah.
Anything more to kind of distill on that?
No, I don't think so. I think that's exactly right. Like whatever it is that you do, you want to make sure that you have the buy-in of the people that you're practicing with to communicate about it in the way that you want to communicate. So I think as we talk about communication in general, like you want to communicate intent, and then you want to make sure that the content of what you communicate feels good to the people who are a part of your pocket of excellence, so that it's encouraging to them, right? You don't want to encourage other people, but then discourage the person who helped you by talking about it in a way that makes them uncomfortable. For sure, yeah.
So speaking of communication, if you think about if you're a leader in a large organization and you're starting, maybe with a smaller group in this pocket of excellence, how would you think about communicating out more broadly if we're aware that we don't want to boil the ocean and we don't want people maybe starting to think, oh my gosh, there's this big change a brewing, and without really knowing what it is, and people tend to fill in the blanks with fear typically. So how do you think about a broader, more organization-wide communication?
You have to decide your order of operations here. I think in my experience, one of the ways, like if I was doing this, if I was thinking about how to counsel someone to do this, or if I was doing this on my own team, what I would say is there's almost always a reason that people pursue these things. I will say that like nobody starts the process of trying to change the culture of an organization without a pretty good reason, because everybody's at least soberly aware of that is going to be challenging to accomplish that. So the way that I would think about communicating this is you start out with the rationale, right? You say like, and it's almost always the case that if change is necessary, you want that change to you want there to be a pull for that change, and you want to find the place where there's a pull for that change and start there. But the most common thing that we hear is like, hey, we ran a survey of people in the organization. We ran some sort of engagement survey, and here's what we got back, right? What people said was that, they're not getting the kind of guidance that they need in order to be successful in their role. Okay. And because of that, we think we want to try to bring in this idea of radical candor to help us create an environment where it's easier for people to have these kinds of conversations. And what I would love to do is to get some, I'm curious, are there some volunteers? Are there some people who either feel like they're already practicing this or, would be excited to sort of try this out? We'd love to figure out what it is that folks need in order to achieve this goal of giving each other the kind of guidance they need to be successful and kind of inspired by radical candor. So I think you can make some decisions. You can say like this, we've chosen a framework, but we're asking for volunteers. And in my experience, there's somebody who's like, it's almost always the case that somebody's willing to experiment. And then the goal is for people to hear from those folks, right? What we just described, which is this sort of like run the experiment, talk about the successes, acknowledge the failures, but focus more on positive examples of like the way you can make it, ways you can make it work. Make them into the heroes, right? So like they get to tell their story. So it was the couple of designers who decided to do this that got up in front of the company and presented the results. Right. It wasn't me going, getting in front of people and saying, look what my team did. It was really making them the work that they did, the story. It communicates a couple of things at once. One is that like all the stuff that we talked about, that's possible to be successful and there's model that you can follow and all the other stuff. But two, like it makes it clear that the goal of this change is not self-serving, right? It's not like leaders think this is important. It's not like I say, therefore you do, right? This is like your colleagues, your peers, they find real value in this, and let's showcase them. And it requires effort. So it's worth celebrating the effort that it took to achieve this positive result, and make them the heroes or the sort of examples of that change. Now, some people may not be comfortable with that, may not want to do that. They're probably not your best first volunteers, right? But I would say almost everybody enjoys, at least to some level, talking about a thing that they tried, and describing like what they thought was helpful or successful about that. Like that, people take pride in their work and they want to have a chance to talk about it. This isn't really any different.
Yeah, I was wondering as you were sharing, I was putting myself in the position of someone who might reach out to us. Maybe they run L&D or training. Maybe they're a leader in sort of the middle of an organization. They're like, oh, I really am passionate about radical candor. I think it's great. And not sure how my CEO or how my executive team is thinking about it. Like, what guidance do you have for folks who there's maybe some pockets there, but there's others that are not yet there?
We've been talking, the example that I just gave is when like cultural change is something that is being like the organization has decided to invest in. But there are other ways that culture changes, and one of the ways that culture changes is that people demand it, and the way that they demand it is through their behavior, right? They change what they're doing in order to get closer to the culture that they want. When I think about the types of objections that we get from executives and CEOs and things like executives of all stripes, but especially CEOs, it's more like skepticism that there's actual value to be derived from trying to shift the culture. Like that's the healthy kind of objection, right? Skepticism is not unhealthy. I do think that there's another kind of objection that you can get from an executive or CEO, which is I don't actually agree with this culture. I do not think this is the right culture for our organization to have. Like, I don't agree with radical candor as a concept. Like, I don't agree with care personally and challenge directly as a frame. And that's a very difficult objection to overcome. And going back to point number one, which is like, you can't change people, like people have to choose to change. That may not be, that environment may not be open to this kind of change. But skepticism is often interpreted as the same thing as being against holding a different belief. And I don't think that that is true. In fact, most of the time, I think what executives are probably worrying about is like, this is going to take a bunch of time, potentially cost a bunch of money, and we're not likely to get a significant result. And so if you could start by showing results, right? You start with the end in mind and you say, like, here are the positive results. Like, this team has seen an increase in productivity or retention or whatever it is. Like, we've seen some positive results of this, or just sentiment, right? The feeling as though they're getting the kind of guidance that they need in order to be successful. I think when you start with those results, that often perks up an executive's ears to say, because then the question is, okay, so how much does this cost? And like, how is this really different from what we're doing? Those are all that's all healthy skepticism that's worth trying to address, I think.
Yeah, and you had mentioned about experimenting, being a tinkerer yourself, and those pockets of excellence. So, if you were, let's say, rather than working at a small company of Radical Candor, let's say that you had a new role and you wanted to experiment in a large organization. Beyond, you've started with the pockets of excellence. Like, where would you go from there? Like, if you were kind of doing a year of Radical Candor, like what would that look like, based on where you sit right now?
I think the next thing that would be on my mind is like, can I identify another team or somebody else to try? Because I wouldn't assume that like the pockets of excellence that I have are necessary. Like, two data points are not, they're not a pattern necessarily. So I would say like that would be my next thought is like, can we create like a pockets of excellence program? Is there a way for us to share like quick tips or ideas for these other teams to try and see how it goes with teams in other parts of the company or organization? Because ultimately, like what I want to be able to report back to my CEO if I'm, chief people officer or whatever, and I'm put in charge of trying to make this change, is that not only is this effective, but like people enjoy, like they like it, right? Like they're asking to be a part of it. So that's what I'd be thinking about. Is like, how can I make it attractive for people to sort of raise their hand and try out some of the things that these pockets of excellence have done. And incentives don't hurt. Like, I think this is a case where even a small incentive or acknowledgement of like, you might benefit, like, for the first 5 teams that sign up to experiment with this, there's, we'll buy you, we'll take the team out for lunch or something. You know what I'm saying? Like, I think you can, I think you can incentivize people because they're taking a risk. And so we want to make sure that we do something to reward to reward that risk taking. So that'd be like the next thing I'm thinking of, which is like, how do I is there a way to avoid sort of like the tendency, which is like you start to see some success and then there's this desire to like create a top down mandate that people like must start doing things, which I don't think is particularly effective. It's like runs the risk of being creating the boiling the ocean problem. And then maybe the most important thing is to remember that part of your job, if you're trying to be a cultural change agent, is to be a marketer. You know what I'm saying? It's like sell the story of what's happening, and why you think it's working, and then to solicit feedback, from people, to be open to people's concerns, apprehensions about what this might mean for the organization if we're successful.
Awesome. Well, I think what might be helpful, Jason, as we wrap, is to think about things to try as an individual. Let's say you're in your own sort of initial pocket of excellence, like as an individual, in your own practice of radical candor. And then I'm also curious, like, let's say, how might I get started if I was as that change agent? So I think thinking about if I am, let's say you and I are starting up our own pocket of excellence, we could, with Brandy, we could start soliciting feedback in one-on-one conversations with each other. Would that be one of the places to start?
Yeah, in the blog post, I think I suggested a couple of different things, which is like small groups of people can do a couple of things that are pretty simple to get the ball rolling. One of them is make a commitment to solicit feedback from one another over the course of a couple of weeks. So don't make this like a long, drawn out thing. Make it shorter and more intense, right? So for the next month, once a week, we're going to solicit some feedback. And again, it doesn't need to be a team of 20. Like a team of 3 is a fine place to start. Another great place to start is by focusing on practicing core public praise, like giving public praise, but like using core as the framing for it, so that you start to create a sense of what it looks like to receive helpful developmental praise. And remember, like to focus on the like results and next steps, like the context and the observation, like what the person did well in what situation. That's really important. But focusing on the result and what's going to happen next because of that is really motivating. And then finally, the simplest way to start is to have a conversation, to share stories, share a story with your team, and encourage some other people to do the same of a time that they received feedback that was really helpful to them in their career. I think sometimes the motivation for there's like latent motivation for being a part of a more radically candid culture, and we have to remind ourselves, because can feel scary and there's some risk associated with it. We have to remind ourselves why it's important, and one of the best ways to do that, and that is encouraging to other people, is to make ourselves vulnerable and to share a time when we were criticized that was really helpful to us, to demonstrate that not only do we value this, but we're open to it, right? Like we're willing to receive criticism. So not only did it help us, but we're kind of excited for more of it.
So those are some great tips for what we can do wherever we are in an organization individually. And if you are looking to bring radical candor into your culture, develop a more radically candid culture, here are some tips you can use to get started.
Tip number 1, start small. Focus on one team or one group of people. It doesn't even have to be an entire team. A group of 3 to 5 people. At Radical Candor, we've seen how these pockets of excellence can become a spark that ignites a larger cultural shift, because they become a model for others. As more people see the benefits, the momentum starts to build on its own, and you get a pull versus push type of change in culture.
Tip number 2, lead by example. Communicate to your team that you recognize the need for more radically candid interactions and that you're committed. You are the one who is starting to make the change. So share your intention to improve, ask for their help by inviting them to give you feedback on your feedback style. This kind of collaborative approach, it's not going to only accelerate your growth, it encourages others to embrace the change, especially when you share vulnerability, where you've made mistakes, where you've received radical candor.
Tip number 3, you can join the Radical Candor community, which is our new online home for leaders to gather and help one another apply the principles of radical candor to succeed at work. Anybody who's listening can head on over to community.radicalcandor.com and sign up for an account today. The community has been in beta for a little while now, and there's already a whole bunch of really great tips from leaders around the world about how they are building more radically candid cultures with their teams.
And for more tips, you can check out our YouTube channel, where you can not only listen to this podcast, but also watch dozens of other Radical Candor videos. Show notes for this episode are at radicalcandor.com/podcast. Praise in public, criticize in private. If you like what you hear, please do rate and review us wherever you listen to your podcast. It really helps. And if you've got criticism, please do email. We read every one, podcast@radicalcandor.com. Bye for now.
Take care.
The Radical Candor podcast is based on the book Radical Candor, Be a Kick-Ass Boss Without Losing Your Humanity by Kim Scott. Episodes are written and produced by Brandy Neal, with script editing by me, Amy Sandler. The show features Radical Candor co-founders Kim Scott and Jason Rosoff and is hosted by me, still Amy Sandler. Nick Carissimi is our audio engineer. The Radical Candor podcast theme music was composed by Cliff Goldmacher. Follow us on LinkedIn, Radical Candor the company, and visit us at radicalcandor.com.